Hi, I'm Cheyanne Scharbatke-Church, and I'm the Executive Director of BESA Global and the co-director of our flagship effort, the Corruption, Justice, and Legitimacy Program. And this is my colleague, Peter Woodrow, one of our senior advisors. One of the things we spend a lot of time thinking about is what do you need to know about corruption in a particular place to design effective programs? This is what we call corruption analysis. And in this video, we will describe briefly what that is and why we think everyone should do it to set up more effective programming.
We started thinking together about corruption analysis for endemically corrupt contexts about 10 years ago, around 2012. At that time, I was working with our colleague Diana Chigas, developing systems approaches for conflict analysis. So Cheyanne came to us with a proposal asking, could we try to use what we had learned for conflict to understand endemic corruption better?
I went to Diana and Peter at that time because I felt that anti-corruption needed to be more strategic and impactful to make a difference in the places I was working, which were predominantly fragile or conflict-affected states. The issue I saw was that much anti-corruption programming was not fit for purpose. The approaches typically assumed corruption was a one-off transaction involving a bad apple or two. And if there were better rules or sanction enforcement and education, these folks would get in line. This didn't fit the reality that I was experiencing, where corruption involved regularized practices at all levels of society, what we now call endemic corruption.
In order to take the endemic nature of corruption into account, we have to understand how it's functioning within a particular environment. From there, we can design better anti-corruption programs that deliver results that matter in the place where they're implemented.
Let's use the project cycle as our starting point. The project cycle lays out the typical phases that a project goes through, starting with analysis, which then feeds program design, and so on. Doing a sound corruption analysis sets us up to develop far better theories of change in our program design stage. A theory of change is simply an articulation of our assumptions around how change happens. And those assumptions need to be grounded in a specific context. Hence, the need for analysis. And what does a better theory of change do? Well, if implemented well and adapted appropriately based on good monitoring, it leads to more effective results.
So we always want to start with analysis because this is the stage where we determine what corruption happens in a specific context, and more importantly, why and by whom. Now, of course, when we actually analyze corruption, we must be more specific about which particular type of corruption behavior we're referring to. So nepotism is not the same as bribery, which is distinct from sextortion, for example.
Our analysis process seeks to identify the key stakeholders, the drivers and enablers of corruption, and the relationships between those factors. A driver is any factor that generates corruption, for instance, greed, survival, social pressure, maintaining power, etc. Enablers, on the other hand, are those things in the environment that set up the conditions for corruption. So not having a clear law, insufficient sanctions, a lack of data. These things don't cause corruption, but create the conditions in which corruption can flourish.
In addition to the drivers and enablers, we also need to identify the key actors and their power, their interests, and their relationships. This is critical to targeting an intervention and determining who will fight back. For this, we do a stakeholder analysis, which we will talk about separately.
So, corruption analysis is a process to understand the what, the why, and the who of corruption in a particular place. Let me say a little bit about what a corruption analysis is not. Corruption analysis is not an investigation. It doesn't seek to identify exactly who stole what or who inappropriately pressured whom for what personal gain. A corruption analysis seeks to understand the general patterns of behavior, not the specifics of one case. A corruption analysis is also not the same as a corruption risk assessment, which is a diagnostic tool that identifies weaknesses within a process or institution. And these weaknesses may present opportunities for corruption to occur. A corruption analysis helps us understand what is driving or enabling those weaknesses, and who's gaining and losing from them.
So the difference between a corruption risk assessment and corruption analysis may sound like a small distinction, but it really matters. If we only focus on diminishing the risks identified in a corruption risk assessment and don't look at why corrupt practices are happening, the chances of diminishing the corruption in the medium to long term is low. Why? Because if the drivers behind the behaviors are still present, people will simply adapt their tactics.
Another way corruption is sometimes approached is through the three dominant understandings of why corruption happens, namely corruption as a principal agent problem, corruption as a collective action problem, and corruption as a functional solution. Programs are often implicitly or explicitly grounded in one of these understandings. So programs try to improve the functioning of the principal agent relationship through maybe providing more information or diminishing discretion. Or they speed up laborious administrative processes to fix the problem that corruption has become a functional solution to. But in contexts of endemic corruption, where corrupt acts are habitual or normal, they're not an aberration. Multiple and messy dynamics are common. So all of these understandings could be relevant. And if we limit our perspective to just one, we also limit our potential effectiveness because we don't have a complete picture of what is happening. A corruption analysis transcends these three understandings by exploring if and how each are present in a local context. It also explicitly locates power and social dynamics as critical areas to understand.
So in context of endemic corruption, where the corruption is an everyday practice, corruption analysis helps us to understand what's happening and, more importantly, why and by whom. It looks across multiple fields, including social, economic, and governance structures to identify political, power, and social dynamics. So we hope this short introduction to corruption analysis was useful, and thanks for listening.